Let's learn how to select multiple cells at the same time in Excel, and this time using Ctrl-Shift-Arrow key shortcuts. In one of our previous videos, we learned how the Control-Arrow key shortcuts helped us navigate to the edges of the data very quickly. For example, I am now in cell C5, and if I use Control-Up arrow, it takes me to C1, which is that edge. And if I use Control left, it takes me to cell A1. And again, Control down takes me to A5, Control right gets me back to C5. And now we also recently studied the Shift arrow key, which actually will select cells. For example, from cell C5, if I choose to use Shift up arrow, it is going to select C4 and then do once more. It's going to select C3. And if I want to deselect something, I use Shift down arrow, it deselects one cell, and then Shift down arrow again, it deselects the other cell. So now only C5 is selected. Now we're going to study a new method, which is going to put both of the Control arrow key and Shift arrow key methods together so that we can not only move quickly to the edges of the data, but we can actually select all the cells on our way. So this is the Control Shift arrow key shortcuts. Again, it works in all the 4 directions of your arrow keys, just as always. So now let's try that. So from A1, I'm going to select A1. I'm going to use Control Shift arrow key all together, Control Shift down arrow. It gives me A1 through A5, all selected at the same time. And this is going to be very helpful for you because you're going to be doing this operation very often when you work with data in Excel a lot. Now let's continue exploring this in all the directions. So for example, let me come to A5, and from here, if I do Control Shift right arrow, I select all the 3 cells in this row. And here again, A5 is the active cell because A5's content is in the formula bar. A5 is not shaded with the colors that B5 and C5 are. And this just tells us that A5 is the active cell. And let's move to C5. And from here, if I use Control Shift up arrow key, I can select all the 5 cells there at the same time. Now let's go to cell B1. And from B1, if I try to use the same Control Shift down arrow key, you notice that it only selected B1 and B2. And that is because if you remember, Control arrow shortcut key method actually looks only for the populated cells or the non-empty cells. When it finds an empty cell, it stops before that. And that's what has happened here. B3 is empty, so the selection stopped at B2. Now from this selection, if I do Control Shift down arrow again, so from B2, now we have selected B3 and B4, and this is because Excel's Control arrow key shortcut method, when it finds a blank cell, it then jumps over to the non-empty cell and then stops there. And that's why now we have selected B1, B2, B3, and B4. And if I use Control Shift down arrow again, I select the next one because this is the edge of this data. There's no more data here. And if I use Control Shift down arrow again, you can see that all the cells will be selected, and you can see that by scrolling down further that you have selected all the cells in this column. And that's because there's no other non-empty cell in this direction. So Excel has went to the end of the spreadsheet and it has selected everything, and it still couldn't find any non-empty cell, so it stopped. And if I use Control Shift up arrow key now, I'm moving from the end of the worksheet and I'm finding the first non-empty cell in the upward direction, which is B5. So we have stopped there. And if I can keep continuing, Control Shift up arrow, I move 1 cell above, and that's because this is empty. Excel stops here. And now if I do Control Shift up arrow again, it is going to jump over this blank cell and it's going to come over to B2. There you go. Please make sure that you understand this concept, how cells can be selected together and deselected very quickly and very efficiently, because you're going to be using these shortcut keys very often and saving a lot of time when you work with Excel a lot. So please practice using your own data, or you can use this data, and please practice these shortcuts so that you can become very, very efficient. So now let's also make sure that we understand these shortcuts also apply to columns of cells also. For example, let us start with cell A1. I'm going to use Control-Shift-Down arrow, which selected A1 through A5 together. And now if I want to move in the right direction, as we have learned before, we're going to select more cells. So Control-Shift-Right will actually select more cells. It goes to the right until the last non-empty cell, and it found the last non-empty cell to be C1 from the active cell A1. C1 is the last non-empty cell, and it stopped there. So now that's why we have selected all the 3 columns here. And if I use Control Shift left arrow now, I'm going to go in this direction to the last non-empty cell, and we have reached the active cell again. So we can select multiple columns or multiple rows at the same time using the shortcuts. Let's do one more time. From cell A1, if I use Control Shift right arrow, it takes me to C1. So I've selected A1 through C1 now. And now if I use Control Shift down arrow, I've selected the entire data set quickly in just 2 steps. And this is going to be so much helpful to you when you have the need to select a lot of cells. And if you have cells that go across pages and pages in Excel, this is not going to be easy if you do manually. So these shortcuts will help you in such cases. Now finally, let's understand how the blank cells are handled. For example, I'm going to start from cell C1, and I'm going to use Shift down arrow and then Shift left arrow to select these 4 cells. And now when I press Control Shift down arrow, you can see here that I selected all the cells here in B and C, and that's because I started off with cell C1 as the active cell, again shown in white compared to the light blue. C1 is the active cell. So from the active cell in this direction, this is the last non-empty cell. So that's why the selection stopped here, and these cells were also selected. Now, if I start from B1, let's say, and I select these 4 cells now using the Shift arrow keys, but if I want to use my Control Shift down arrow, you can see here that it didn't select the last row. And what is happening here is, since the B1 is the active cell, you have to think about, in this column, Excel is trying to find the non-empty cell, and it found the first non-empty cell to be this, and that's because it found a blank. It jumped over that and found the first non-empty cell and stopped at B4. Again, this is the same principle that applied to our Control arrow key shortcuts that we studied earlier. Please make sure that you understand that. You're going to learn this by practicing, and you're going to find this more easy to follow if you're practicing these shortcuts in your Excel file as we are studying these approaches.